On the next page of the notes here, you'll see that we start off at the top with some important symbols. We're going to be using a lot of symbols in this class to help us kind of communicate different ideas in a much shorter way. They're going to be our shorthand and the language of statistics. So these symbols are going to be extremely important. I'll say that again. Symbols are going to be extremely important. Here are just two of the symbols, or two types of symbols that we're going to be dealing with here. Obviously, in this box, I have 4 symbols total. We'll talk about them here briefly. You'll see that over on the side, I kind of have what these symbols actually represent. So I have symbols to represent a number of data entries in a data set, and I also have symbols to represent an average, a mean. Now these symbols are further broken down to symbols that talk about populations and samples. Remember that we had this idea that a population was going to be this big group, right? Like a big group of items. And that was going to be filled with a bunch of individuals. And then once those individuals were identified in that population, I could go ahead and take a small sample of them. So I have sample symbols, so if I want to describe the number of items in the sample, or the average for the items in the sample, I use these symbols. But if I want to describe the number of items in the whole population, I have a different symbol. And to describe the average of the whole population, I also have a different symbol. So you'll notice that I have a capital N to represent number of data entries. That should hopefully be pretty easy to remember. N for number. And then little n for the little group. I think those are pretty straightforward and easy to remember. Down here, I have some different symbols. This one over here that stands for a population mean or a population average is a Greek letter. It's the Greek letter mu. So this symbol up here is actually like a U, but it's got like an extra tail on the front side. Okay, so again, we're using that to represent the average of all the items inside the red, all the items in the population. This symbol over here looks like an X with a little bar on top of it, and it is called X bar. Mathematicians aren't always the most creative in naming things, and that's what it's actually referred to as, X bar. Okay, that's going to represent the average for all of the items in the small group. This is a really important distinction. A very important distinction. We have to understand when we're finding averages for the small group or when we're finding an average for everybody. It's like trying to say on a test, give a class average, which would be the big red circle, and the average of all the students in the class, or maybe just the average of you and a couple of your friends, right? Like there's a difference there in what you calculated or who you calculated the average for. Now, there are ultimately going to be a lot of symbols in this class, and if we go over to our Blackboard site, you'll see that actually over here on the side, underneath Exam 1 Materials, you'll see down here I have a link for our symbols to know. And so if I open this, you'll see that there are actually a lot of different symbols to know this semester. The first 2 categories we've already covered, the number of data entries and the mean. But you'll see that there are tons of other symbols that we will be using this semester. So I would highly advise that you get used to using these symbols, you practice using them, you study them, maybe turn them into flashcards or something like that very quickly. Because if you don't know these symbols, it's going to be very difficult for you to communicate appropriately and to interpret what I am attempting to communicate to you appropriately. So what we're going to see is how we can actually utilize these symbols and how these symbols begin to get used by our calculator as well as by us when we perform some different sorts of questions. Now, for the next example here, we're going to start to take a look at how to use our calculator to help us compute some things like means and medians, because we don't want to have to do that by hand for very large data sets. That's really tedious. So if you got a calculator, make sure that you get it out at this point in time. And then let's take a look down here at example number 3. I'm going to skip this box of calculator commands. They'll be here. I'll talk through them as we work through example 3, but I won't just state them directly. So let's see what example 3 states. The data below represents the birth weights in pounds of 24 randomly selected babies. So you can see here I have these listed here. I don't know why in the world people are interested in measuring weights of babies, but these are some weights that we have. Part A, find the mean, median, and mode of the data set using your calculator and state them in context. Okay, so immediately here, I'm going to go ahead and go to my calculator and start to see that I need the calculator to know what these values are. So what I'm going to do is do the following set of commands. If I want to give my calculator a list of numbers, the first button I'm going to click on is this Stat button over here on the side. And when I click on that, it should pull up some menus that look like this. I actually want this very first menu. I'm going to click on number 1, this Edit command. And you'll see in here, I actually already have tons of different values inside of these different lists, and you may or may not have the same. Now, if you have values in a list, it's really easy to go ahead and clear them out. And so you can go ahead and do this. Notice that you can use the arrow keys here to kind of click around and move around the screen. I'm going to go up to L number 1 and highlight it. Now, once this is highlighted, if I click the Clear button and then I click Enter, notice it will kind of just automatically remove everything here in the entire list. Okay, so again, I would go up, I would highlight something like a list name, then I'd click the Clear button, and I'd click Enter to confirm. Once that's done, all the numbers are being deleted. I'm going to go ahead and just do this for each one of my lists. Okay, so I can see here all my lists are kind of now cleared out. Now I don't need all of them cleared, I just really need one. And with this list, I'm going to start to enter in my different numbers that I have in my table. Oops. So I'm going to go ahead and start entering them. I'm kind of going across that top row, and I'm going to make sure I enter every single one of these. So just hit Enter after each one. So go ahead and attempt to enter these into your calculator, just like I'm doing. And then once they're entered, we can actually go ahead and see how to use the calculator to compute the mean and the median for us. Okay, so we're almost done here. Okay, I think I have all those values in. You'll notice that down here in this little set of parentheses, there's a number, and that number is standing for kind of what line you're on. So notice if I scroll up, so I'm highlighting the last number I entered, that was the 24th line, meaning I have 24 entries here, which is good because I was told I had 24 baby weights. Now that the calculator has these values, you can go ahead and click on Second and the Mode button, and you quit out. Okay? No, the calculator is automatically going to have those values saved. You don't have to worry about saving those values. But to have the calculator compute something with those values, we're going to go ahead and click on the Stat button. We're not going to go back to Edit because we're not interested in changing the numbers in the list, but we want to rather go over to this Calculate menu. So I'll click the over arrow, go over to Calculate, and I want this, 1 var stats. Notice I did have one variable here. It was how much does a baby weigh? And I wanted to look at all the numbers that we got in response to that variable, and I want to do some statistics with it. So I click 1 var stats, and one of two things is going to happen. If you have a fancy calculator like mine, then you're going to get a screen that looks like this. It's going to ask you for what list you actually want to go ahead and use. Notice here that I already have list 1 typed in here, but you might not. Notice if I want to change this list, take a look really quickly down here at the numbers on your keypad. Notice that on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, above them, in blue or maybe in yellow on your calculator, you'll see that you have L1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So by clicking your second key and the appropriate number, you can change your list to whatever list you want. Now notice that if I continue to type these in, I might generate multiple lists, but I can just clear and always just re-enter the list that I want. I, of course, want to make sure that I'm entering the list that works with the list that I typed all my numbers in, that matches up. Once that's done, I can go ahead and hit Calculate. Okay, now if you didn't have that calculator menu, that's not a big deal. I'll show you really quickly on the side here what you should have actually seen. So if you didn't have that fancy calculator screen, then on your calculator what probably happened is you had up here something that just said 1 var stats, and it just kind of stopped right there. Well, again, if you can just click second and then whatever list number you needed, you can get to here and then hit enter, and then all the data should pop up on the screen, just like it is popping up on our screen over here. Now what you can see here is that there is a whole bunch of different values. And in fact, this little down arrow says that if you click down, you can actually scroll down and see tons of values here. So the beauty of doing or using the calculator here to find these values using this approach is that we also are able to see tons of other information about our data set that we'll use in later sections. What we'll see is that right up here at the top we have a symbol, X bar. That tells us our average. Strangely though, the calculator doesn't know what symbol to use for average. Remember that we had actually two symbols. We had mu and X bar. The calculator doesn't know whether we entered a population or a sample, so the calculator is always going to default to assume that you had a sample. If that's not what we had, then we need to make sure that we adjust and use the appropriate symbol when describing the average. Now, one other thing that you'll see that I have in here is I have my value of n. Notice that's another symbol. Again, the calculator is assuming that we have a sample, so it's using little n as opposed to capital N. If we knew that this was a population of data values, we would change that to capital N ourselves. And I have tons of other values in here. Notice, down below, I have MED standing for median, and I have that value listed out. So this is great. I have a whole bunch of different numbers here. Now, one other thing that I often like to give you on certain problems is something like what I have down here in green. This right here is a value that you should be able to find on your calculator if you entered in all of this data correctly. Notice that I do have that listed right here, this 1377.17. This is a sum of all my x values being squared. That is all my data values being squared. This is sometimes a great way that I can give you a way to double check to make sure that you have the right numbers entered into your calculator before you start writing down all of your answers. So notice here, if I wanted to write down my answers, it would be pretty simple. I'm going to go ahead and use appropriate symbols, and I'll know here that this is a sample of babies, so I'm going to use X bar to stand for my average. And since my average went on for a long time, I'm going to go ahead and round this off to 4 decimal places. So 7.5292. So 7.5292. My median, I can go back to my calculator and find, scrolling down, that's 7.4. That's exact. However, the mode is not told to be on the calculator. The mode, unfortunately, I'm going to have to go ahead and try to find myself. Now, for the moment, I'll go ahead and just tell you here that I got a value of 7 and a value of 7.2. I think those both occur in that table up above 3 times. So this data set is bimodal. Now, the last things that I need to include here, again, is units. So when I say that the average was 7.5292, that's 7.5292 what? Well, you guessed it, this would be pounds. And in fact, all of these numbers are pounds. In the next video, we'll go ahead and finish off this section by taking a look at parts B and C.